Thanks to everyone for being here. I think more people will trickle in, but that's totally fine. Um, so first of all, I just want to introduce the BSS briefly for those of you who don't know. The Black Sheep Society is a recently founded, I think now 2.5 years old, group mostly sort of loosely affiliated around ASEEES, though not officially affiliated with ASEEES, of left-leaning, big tent, leftist organization scholars interested in the region of Greece or in sort of state socialist history and society in general. And yeah, we've been holding a number of these events. We have a few of them on our YouTube channel, which you can find. If you're interested in getting in touch with us, maybe soliciting events like this or talking about ASEEES panels, we also run a stream of ASEEES panels as well. All of these things you can do. You can sign up in our, we have a little RSVP form for the sign up thing for the listserv, which we can put in the chat. And we'd love to hear from you with any kind of comments, suggestions, anything. So I'm going to be very brief in introducing the panelists because I think so many people already know everyone here. And I'd really like to leave as much time as possible for the discussion. So Sheila Fitzpatrick is now of Australian Catholic University. She has many books, but her most recent, I believe, and correct me if this is wrong, is Lost Souls, Soviet Displaced Persons in the Birth of the Cold War. Ronald Suny is a emeritus professor at the University of Michigan. His most recent book is Stalin, Passage to Revolution, but he has another forthcoming book. I believe the manuscript has been submitted on the Longue Durée History of the Nation. Do you want to give us the title of that one, Ron?
Forging the Nation, the Making and Faking of Nationalisms.
Excellent. And then...
Okay, Renny, can I add my latest then?
Oh, yes, please.
After Lost Souls is Death of Stalin. Just came out this week.
Oh, right. Well, okay, thank you. Excellent. Death of Stalin just this week. Lewis Siegelbaum is a emeritus professor at Michigan State University. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, his most recent book is his memoir, Stuck on Communism, Memoir of a Russian Historian, very relevant to our discussions today. Lewis, do you have anything you want?
A co-edited volume with Arch Getty called Reflections on Stalinism.
Right. Thank you. Anna Krylova is professor at Duke. She is a sort of a later generation. Sheila, Ron, and Lewis are all sort of unambiguously considered usually within the revisionist school. We'll talk, of course, about what it means to be considered within the revisionist school in these discussions. Anna is not of a sort of later generation. I believe got her PhD in 2001, if I'm wrong, but has written a lot about sort of revisionism and post-revisionism and these sort of different schools. And so we wanted to have her here to give a sort of different generation's view on a previous generation. Her first book was Soviet Women in Combat, A History of Violence on the Eastern Front. And I believe you just submitted your latest book manuscript a few months ago. Is that right, Anna?
Yes. So the title is History Writing or Sleepwalking Through History in Neoliberal Times.
Another extremely relevant book, I'm sure, to this particular session. Okay, so just a brief overview of the format. I'm going to talk very, very briefly about sort of what revisionism, the totalitarian school, means. I think for the historians of the audience, this will be completely unnecessary, but the BSS, for the most part, for whatever reasons, is mostly literary studies people and a few others, sociologists, political scientists, and whatever. I think that my general impression is that people in those fields will be, familiar with some of the works, but not necessarily as familiar with how historians break up these schools, how these schools relate to sort of other historical fields. Stuff like that. So I'm just going to talk about that very briefly. Then I'm going to give a few questions to the panel. They're going to give a sort of longer spiel about revisionism, and then we're going to move into sort of as much dialogue as we can get through with the group. Okay, so without further ado, let me just give you a very brief little panel, if I can find it. Here it is. Everyone can see this okay? Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is just a little sort of diagram of what people often mean when they talk about revisionist history. And we can talk about, do any of these labels actually make sense? Are they really so concrete during the discussion? The totalitarian school, sort of what dominated from the post-war up until the 1960s. It was largely not written by historians, but mostly political scientists, although some sociologists. Though often with a sort of very historical bent. And they were often as interested in sort of the late Tsarist period more than they were in the the Soviet Union, in part because there was so little access to archives. For these people, totalitarian theory was obviously a very central paradigm, as well as sort of politics and ideology in a sort of classical formal sense. So Karl Joachim Friedrich, Karl Popper, also Hannah Arendt for some people, these were sort of the key interlocutors that they were relying on. The revisionist school, which is the subject that we're talking about today, sort of, I think, begins in the very late 60s. With often associated with sort of the new left, with that generation, becomes very dominant over the course of the 70s and 80s, becomes prevalent in the field, something you had to contend with, and was very much associated with social history and with figures like E.P. Thompson. This was a key influence. Later, beginning sort of in the late 80s, 90s, you see the growth of what is quickly called the post-revisionist school. This school was largely called that from the outset, where sort of revisionist school and totalitarian school were often sort of gained those monikers afterwards. It's sort of a debate, is post-revisionism still the defining school today? It's a little bit unclear, I think. I'm happy to hear what other people think about this. And this was very much associated with the rise of cultural history and cultural theory, and particularly people like Michel Foucault. The story we're very all familiar with. And I just wanted to telegraph that this sort of trajectory of Soviet Russian history matches pretty closely the trajectory in other regional fields of historiography. For those of you who are not historians, historians are very regionally divided. That is sort of the most obvious ways that we end up divvying ourselves up. That's the way that most jobs are hired. You're hired as a Russianist, you're hired as an Americanist or whatever. Of course, you can have sort of thematic connections, but the regional school tends to prevail over others. So for instance, I consider myself doing both Soviet history and American history, or at least attempting to. So I have sort of one foot in each door. And so in American historiography, deeply related schools. So the totalitarian school, the equivalent in American historiography, was the consensus school, which is to say the belief that American society was, for better or worse, bound by a sort of consensus, a political and social consensus throughout history from the founding. And that's why you didn't have socialism. That's why you had, X and Y characteristics or whatever. It sounds like not particularly related to the totalitarian school, but actually these people were often very closely related. They read a lot of the same works. They sort of wrote their histories on top of each other. You also had a revisionist school as well, also called the revisionist school, also very much associated with the New Left, also very much associated with E.P. Thompson and these kind of figures, and was very much implicated in the Cold War, sort of reversing stereotypes about the sort of position of the U.S. And the world as an enlightened, liberal, non-imperial kind of polity. There was revisionist school was very interested in flipping that. But interestingly, and I think in part just because American history is so big, there are so many historians, it is such a massive field, nothing really came after revisionism. There were no schools afterwards. It kind of split apart. No one really, there's no sense of a post-revisionist school, although I think you could make an argument that there is one. That has certainly not been a label that has appeared particularly. And there's still, there's some debates today about, what schools are there in American history, but they don't really catch on. It's not this kind of thing that people would be familiar with at conferences, for instance, if you talked about them. So, for instance, there's been a neo-consensus school. These are not really familiar terms. So it's very interesting to me that Soviet and Russian history, these terms have really had a lot of power. People have really associated with them. There's a lot of big state of the field essays, every decade or so, where people really debate these categories and whatnot. I find that's a particular feature, how marked that is in Soviet Russian history and how controversial these have been. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing there. And now, just very briefly, I want to really try to frame what revisionism meant at the time. Sheila has written about this in one of her papers, that she found it very difficult to explain to later generations of historians who didn't live through the Cold War, kind of what it was like having the Cold War in the room and in the history seminar. And so I want to properly frame what it felt like for those of us, including myself, who were not there for it. I want to briefly recall the words of a dearly departed comrade, who I'm sure would have loved to be here today, Richard Pipes. He explained to the public in 1993 that in the 1970s and 1980s, self-proclaimed revisionists in the field of Soviet history took over many of the leading university chairs in the United States, England, and Germany. and by means of patronage, more appropriate to politics than scholarship, impose their views on students and professional organizations. The consequence has been a stultifying form of political correctness in the writing and teaching of 20th century Russian history. Such thought control is a new and highly disturbing phenomenon with no obvious parallel in any other branch of historiography, save possibly Black studies. In practice, the revisionist conception of the origins of the Soviet state comes close to those promoted by the now defunct communist establishment. Like the early Bolsheviks, the revisionists are broad-minded toward their own kind, but ferociously intolerant of outsiders. Their combativeness, their unwillingness to seek common ground with their predecessors and members of other schools suggest a disturbing absence of a genuine scholarly spirit. They and their doctoral students turn out, year in, year out, weighty monographs laden with tables and footnotes on the workers of Petrograd, the workers of Moscow, factory committees, industrial strikes, workers' red guards, and such. The heroes of these studies, however, never come to life. The reader has the impression that the authors have never met a real flesh and blood factory worker. They appear as pallid abstractions, like the noble savages of the 18th century philosophers, and like them, unexceptionally noble. And fortunately for the revisionists, their legacy is not likely to amount to much. As the old adage has it, what is true in their writings is not new, and what is new is not true. Quite apart from the fact that the political implications of their argument have been robbed of both relevancy and appeal by the collapse of communism, their self-imposed limitation to ignore 9/10 of the stuff of history dooms them to remain monographers and nothing more, brickmakers without an architectural vision. Their inability to come up with an original survey of the Russian Revolution suggests that their exertions are unlikely to contribute more than a footnote to future histories. Thank you so much, Comrade Pipes. So today we want to talk a bit about the sort of the relevancy and the legacy revisionist history, and as Pipes, I think, implores us to do, now more than 3 decades after the collapse of state socialism. We live now in a very different historical time from in which that piece was written, and a very different moment of historiography than that of the sort of bitter Cold War struggles of the past. But in recent years, if I can kind of sum up the attitude of a lot of people in the Black Sheep Society, there seems to be a sort of shifting of the winds, a sense that there is a renewed need for a principled leftist scholarship in historiography. And that requires us today to remember and reflect on previous generation of scholars, both those of the left and perhaps those just accused of being of the left, in order to better understand our own place in our own intellectual history. So without further ado, I'd like to get on to what our panelists have to say, to ask them what revisionism was to them, what their sort of relationship was with it, and what they feel is important to know about it today. So Ron, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. First, Renny, thank you for organizing this, and for the other members of the Black Sheep Society for putting this together. And thank you all for coming. I see people as close as Ann Arbor and as far away as Moscow and Petersburg, and very happy that all this is gathered, and my wonderful colleagues with whom I've worked all these years, the other members of the panel. So I'm calling this piece just on revisionism from the totalitarian model to social and cultural histories. And as Renny mentioned, this T model, totalitarianism, was basically the dominant frame and the dominant lens through which a whole generation of people before the revisionists saw the Soviet Union. And it was particularly a political science framing through the 1950s and into the 60s. And it was precisely at a moment when the academy was intimately involved in the global struggle that pitted the West against the Soviet Union, its satellite states, and let's not forget anti-colonial nationalism as well. To give you an idea of what might be written, one of the best books in this tradition was by Merrill Feinsod, How Russia is Ruled, and he wrote something like this: the model of a gargantuan prison state, quote, a huge reformatory in which the primary difference between the forced labor camps and the rest of the Soviet Union is that inside the camps, the regimen is much more brutal and humiliating, unquote. So this was compelling because high Stalinism matched much of the image of a degenerated autocracy, and because Soviet restrictions and censorship eliminated most other sources like travelers and journalists and scholars with in-country experience. Most of the scholarship in the West was without hands-on exploration within the Soviet Union. So here was this image, very powerful, that you had to live with. And I remember it well. My earliest memories, besides the death of Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, not Teddy Roosevelt, was of the McCarthy hearings, the death of Roosevelt and the McCarthy hearings. And here was this very powerful image that took up all the air of an imperialist totalitarianism spreading its red grip over the globe. And this, to me, was a product of Western anxieties and the producer of what now we can see as inflated fears. And there was a canon that people all read. George Orwell was at the center of it, Animal Farm, and of course, in 1984, where the hero Winston Smith tries futilely to revolt against the totally administered society presided over by Big Brother. But he ultimately is ground into submission. And the dominant book that only scholars read, but still, and was Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, which, if you actually read it carefully, has a very anti-democratic ring to it. It's very suspect of mass democracies. She's really a proponent of what you might call class liberal democracy. So for one more example, Russians, it was concluded, here's another quote, "We're not quite human beings." And you hear this, by the way, today as well, in the way Putin's Russia is mentioned. They only understand power or suffering or something. But here's what was written at the time. Russians endure physical suffering with great stoicism and are indifferent about the physical sufferings of others. Therefore, no techniques are yet available for eradicating the all-pervasive suspicion which great Russians, leaders and led alike, feel toward the rest of the world. This suspicion springs from unconscious and therefore irrational sources and will not be calmed more than momentarily by rational accounts. So, here was the image. Russians were brainwashed, as other communists and leftists were. It was the country of the blind, in the words of George Counts. The totalitarian approach then turned an apt, if not wholly accurate description into a model complete with predictions of future trajectories. And that's important as part of the critique of the totalitarian model. It was not just descriptive, it was not just analytical in some sense. It not only compared communism, Stalinism to fascism, to Nazism, but it was also predictive. It was going to tell you things about how this country would act on the basis of the way Hitler's Nazi Germany acted, right? It would be expansionist and so forth. And that meant that any kind of adjustment to the Soviet Union, any kind of negotiation, would be seen in the dominant metaphor of the day as appeasement, right? 1938, Munich, and so forth. So this concept had several problems with it that the revisionists would try to deal with. First of all, it always exaggerated the similarities between fascism and communism, of which there are many, terror, dictatorship, one party, etc., and underestimated differences between quite different regimes. After all, the Soviet Union was not capitalist in any way, particularly, and Nazi Germany was. One was a highly developed society, Nazi Germany, industrialized and capitalist. The other was much backward and largely peasant, etc. And it ignored the contrast between what was essentially, ideologically, an egalitarian internationalist doctrine, that is Marxism, even in its Marxist-Leninist variety, that the Soviet Union failed to realize, and the inegalitarian, racist, and imperialist ideology, fascism, that the Nazis implemented only too well. And little was said about these different dynamics in state capitalist system with private ownership of property as in Nazi Germany, and those operating in a completely state-dominated economy with almost no production for the market, except maybe in collective farms and farm markets, the USSR. And how an advanced industrial society geared essentially to war and territorial expansion, Nazi Germany, how that differed from a program for modernizing a backward peasant society and transforming it into an industrial urban one, namely Stalinist Soviet Union. So that was one problem. Another problem was that the T model led many political scientists and historians to deal almost exclusively with the state, the center, and the top of the political pyramid, and then make deductions from a supposedly fixed ideology that was, everything was deduced from, it wasn't inductive the way revisionist scholarship would be, deductive from either Marx himself, Marxism, Leninism, Lenin, what is to be done or whatever. And largely this political ideologically centered approach ignored social dynamics and the shifts and improvisations that actually characterized both Soviet and Nazi policy. In other words, in many ways, you could also say that totalitarianism was an impossibility, a kind of unachieved utopian, though many of the programs and ambitions of Nazis and Stalinists was indeed totalitarian. So you could say there were totalitarian ambitions, but of course, the little screws, as Stalin called them, and others resisted that. And Sheila's work has very much shown the varieties of behaviors, of ways of dealing with this top-down system. Nazi Germany, on the other hand, was expansionist and aggressive, and it could be expected that another totalitarian regime would also be aggressive and expansionist. Indeed, during the Cold War, Western media and governments would foster the notion that the USSR was poised and ready not only to occupy its buffer lands in East Central Europe, but actually to invade Western Europe and had global ambitions of conquest. Any concessions to Soviet communism then were a kind of treason, appeasement, again, something that was analogous to the Nazis. Well, critiques developed. It didn't quite work. Soviet Union was changing, particularly after Stalin's death. And then the totalitarians had to ramble around to figure out what's actually happening here. You know, terror had been, after all, the linchpin of modern totalitarianism. But under the post-Stalin regime, the Gulag was being dismantled. Terror was being replaced by delivering the goods, better material life, greater freedoms, and persuasion rather than terror. And so someone like Zbigniew Brzezinski, who had written that terror, I quote, is the most universalist characteristic of totalitarianism, by 1962 was saying terror is no longer essential. The USSR is now, and I quote, a voluntarist totalitarian system in which persuasion, indoctrination, and social control can work more efficiently, unquote. So in other words, they just got rid of certain things and changed it, but kept the label, which then delayed a lot of real understanding of the Soviet Union into the post-Stalin era. I want to tell you a little story. As a very young scholar, I got involved in this anti-totalitarian controversy. At the invitation of a friend and colleague at the time, Bill Rosenberg of Michigan, I presented a paper called The Abuses of the Soviet Past on a panel called Uses of the Soviet Past, a Critical Review. This was at the 1970 meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies. The response from many in the audience, I won't mention their names, was, because I was criticizing the totalitarian model, was incredibly hostile, even accusatory. That is, this was unscholarly, this was an impossible thing. And I, in my youth and untenuredness, decided not to publish this paper or go on, and I would only pursue this line of inquiry in print many, many years later. So that was the T model. It was based primarily on sharp differences between, on the one hand, communist and fascist societies and liberal societies. So it was highly ideological. It was basically a defense of liberal capitalist bourgeois democracies. And it was replaced eventually, or it kind of was challenged by a second paradigm called the modernization model, which instead of seeing these things as distinct, proposed a universal and shared development. So in the years when modernization theory and its kissing cousin convergence theory held sway, was also a period where you could imagine the Soviet Union more benign than terroristic Stalinism, and maybe a tolerable enemy than had been proposed by the T model theorists. So that was already becoming an opening for new ways of thinking. Now, during the totalitarian dominance, there were scholarly dissenters. there were people, some Marxists like Maurice Daub, but most of them not particularly Marxist. E.H. Carr, Isaac Deutscher, you'd certainly say would be a Marxist, Theodor von Lauer, Alex Nove, Moshe Levine, a Marxist, Alex Dallin, a non-Marxist, probably son of a Menshevik, however, Robert E. Tucker, C. Tucker, and others. So note that most of these dissenters I mentioned were not in the United States. Russian studies in the United States range from more liberal or what might be called détentist views, but not particularly Marxist. And most of the dissent for that earlier period was in Britain and elsewhere. I mentioned, and I'm going to be a little bit fast here, I mentioned that there was a first revisionism. That was about the revolution. And it set up some of the approaches that would later be taken over by those who would deal with Stalinism. First of all, the revisionists of 1917, of which I was a member, was one, political history isn't enough. Top-down history is not enough. You've got to do social history as well. It's not just about committees and politics. It's also about the working class. Let's not forget. So that was already an introduction. And what those revisionists argued was, rather than this being all about a coup d'etat by Lenin, you can certainly call the October Revolution that if you like, there was much more popular support for the Bolsheviks, who won over under against the views of Mensheviks and SRs and others and liberals. And that revisionism gave a kind of, you could say, legitimacy, that was a word that people like Pipes really hated, to the Soviet regime, that it had been, at least momentarily at least, in 1917 and early 1918, a very popular thing. That will change during the Civil War. Terror will be instituted. Other things will come about. But this new view that was heralded by these early revisionists would have influences on the way people began to think. Some of us, very few of us, but a number of us also thought we can't just do the center. This is not a history just about Russia. Half the population, if not more, are non-Russians. We ought to look at nationalities. If we're doing bottom-up, look at from the periphery to the center as well. And then finally came the revisionists with people like Moshe Levine and Sheila Fitzpatrick, who were almost alone at the beginning of doing Soviet history. Mark Ryeff told us at Columbia, there is no history after 1917. This was an old Karpovich view. And so those people, like the pioneers like Levine and Fitzpatrick, were moving into a kind of desert where there wasn't much literature to fight with. But now Stalinism could be described no longer as simply totalitarian, but as a stage of development of non-capitalist statist regimes in developing countries dominated by Leninist parties. And this seemed to be the trend in Eastern Europe, in China, in Vietnam, in North Korea, and so forth.
Ron, can I interrupt just to say, if you could wrap up relatively soon, and we can come back to some of your other thoughts.
I am wrapping up. That's what I'm doing.
Okay, great. Sorry.
A key question dividing Soviet studies was the issue of continuity or rupture between the regimes of Lenin and Stalin. And so a key question that the revisionists would have to deal with was Stalinism implicit in original Marxism or the Leninist version, or had there been alternatives, Bukharinism or NEP or something like that, open to Bolsheviks? So here was this cohort who now moved from political history to social history, challenging the top-down view, looking for initiatives from below, finding even popular resistance to the regime's agenda. Again, it was largely Russo-centric or Soviet-centric, leaving out, sadly, though some of us were tilling those fields, the peripheries outside. Basically, the view was accepted by Pipes and Conquest and others, and by nostalgic nationalists from the emigre community. Nationalism was seen as a release of denied desires and authentic, perhaps primordial aspirations. The view that nationality was constructed would come later with the next move from social history to the cultural turn. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. That was really lovely. Sheila, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. You brought in Richard Pipes, so I think I'll start with Richard Pipes. I met him first when I was a postdoc in London at the, I guess the LSE at that time, playing tennis on the invitation of Abe Brumberg, who was then the editor of Problems of Communism. Anyway, Abe was a bit fed up with me because I would tease him about being CIA when he was actually USIA. Anyway, so to get back at me, Abe said, here is my young friend Sheila. She is a new left activist. And Pipes, he had no reason to think this was relevant information at the time, but he had a retentive memory. And so when I showed up in the United States a while later, he knew what I was. I was a British New Left activist who had come to peddle a political agenda in Soviet history. Now, in my view, that was a very inaccurate, well, it was simply wrong. I was not a New Left activist. But if I wasn't that, I guess I need to say a few words about who I was. I was an Australian who, from a family of historians, my father was on the left, though he was an old left person, obviously, given his age, but he was on the left and indeed an activist, although not a communist. Now, as growing up, I was to some degree influenced by him and to some degree fighting with him. When I came into I went into Soviet history because it seemed like a really interesting challenge, and also because Russian was the language that I had done at the University of Melbourne. You had to do a language, and Russian was mine. Therefore, I decided to use it. My training as a historian had left on me a very strong feeling that it was the historian's obligation to try to be objective. Now, this is, of course, incredibly old-fashioned language, but that was the way I saw things. And what I translated that into with regard to Soviet history was that I wasn't going to be on either side. That is, in the Cold War, I was not either pro or anti the Soviet Union, despite the pressure on both sides to take one of those positions. That was the thing that I held to most strongly. The second thing I had taken all on my own in Britain as writing my doctorate. I had taken a very strong objection to the totalitarian model, partly as a historian who didn't like models, but also it seemed to me absolutely clearly a mask for value judgments. In other words, you wanted to say the Soviet Union was bad, so what can make it really bad is association with Nazi Germany. So I did not give it its due as an intellectual construct. I regarded it as simply a political weapon, I suppose. I also, as I came to look at the not yet existent field of Soviet history, the writing on Soviet history, it was mainly by political scientists. And that didn't sit, so I didn't think that they really, well, I suppose you could say they were doing as good a job as they could with the very limited resources available to them. But I also thought that they restricted their sources far more than was necessary. I had it set in my mind that we had to get into archives, and then we could be proper historians, and then you could start saying something about the Soviet Union. Now, archives, that should be expanded to mean all kinds of primary source material, which was available if you got to the Soviet Union on the exchanges, the British or the American, but basically not otherwise. And I would like to say, with regard to generational change, I think it was enormously important that from the 60s, the young scholars started actually spending time on these government exchanges, but spending time in the Soviet Union. In other words, there was a first-hand sense of things, which made some of the more abstract statements about the Soviet Union and not all that impressive. The generation before ours basically hadn't been able to go. It simply wasn't possible to go and study in the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union had a tremendously abstract quality for that generation, of which I guess Pipes was indeed a member. And now, to that long quote that Renny wrote, I was really denouncing revisionists for seizing control of the field and peddling a political ideology. I was really struck by the mirror image quality of that, because that was exactly really the way that we saw our predecessors. And in fact, when I read Pipes's autobiography, this must be 20 years or so published ago, and I reviewed in the LRB, I remember, and basically he was describing an American Sovietological community which was always rather pro-Soviet and wanted to think the best of the Soviet Union. And so in my review, I said, if only Pipes could have lived in my America and I in his, because it was clear that I would have been very comfortable had I encountered anything like that. But what I encountered was completely different. In other words, it was a domination of people like Pipes, whose approach to the Soviet Union was by definition hostile. In other words, it was not a question of let's look at the data and see how this seems to function. No, you knew that it was, or they knew that it was this was a bad society, and basically what you were, or a bad polity, and what your research should do would be to show that, to demonstrate it. Now, I came at the beginning of the 70s to the United States, very much an outsider. I was not, as already noted, New Left. I was not particularly admirer of E.P. Thompson. I had read, but it didn't it didn't speak to me particularly. In America, I sort of passed as a Brit, but I wasn't British. So, I felt I felt quite sort of fish out of water in all kinds of ways. I ran into all sorts of, very soon I got drawn into a kind of what was going to develop into a revisionist community, but always feeling really quite outside of it. That started with Steve Cohen. Steve Cohen identified me from Britain, I think already, as somebody who had some unorthodox views on Soviet history, and so he sort of summoned me to the revisionist fight, and I thought that all seemed fine. But then we ran into trouble because it became clear that we became on that famous question of continuity or discontinuity. Steve's approach was very much that the revolution, Lenin and the revolution were basically good things, but the whole thing went wrong with Stalin. And this was a basic discontinuity. I was less committed to the notion that the revolution was a good thing. I was also not committed to the notion it was a bad thing, but that was why I was trying to come in without a notion on that. But in any case, I did not see that discontinuity that he described, and so that was a problem. That was the first of my problems with other people called revisionists. The second of my problems came really on the question of Marxist or not, because I wasn't. I didn't see. I did not feel that labor history, that looking at the working class was the most interesting way to go. That didn't really appeal to me at all. And I was by no means persuaded that a class analysis would be all that helpful, all the more as I continued, as my own work developed. And what I came in contact with was a lot of basically the phenomenon of state-sponsored upward mobility from the working class. Now, that is a very interesting social history process, but it's not really reinforcing a sense of class. And as I worked on it, I became more and more convinced that what's interesting about class in Soviet history is basically the importance of class labeling. In other words, in a society where classes have been basically, well, largely, to a large extent, disintegrated as the result of successive upheavals, and are in the process of remaking, no doubt. But in the 20s and 30s, that remaking wasn't completed. But what was enormously important for your success, for your existence in that society, was what class you were supposed to be. That was even in the 20s written on your identity documents. Are you working class, in which case you should be encouraged and helped in every way? Or do you come from the old possessing classes or the bourgeoisie? In which case your progress, you should be encouraged to be downwardly mobile. Now that interest on my part in social mobility got me into a lot of trouble with everybody, right and left. The right-wing objection to it was basically that social mobility is something that happens in the United States as a result of upward mobility, as a result of the democratic system. Therefore, if you point to upward social mobility in another state, you are saying that is a good government. That was not what I was saying, but that was how it was interpreted. I'll just and then we had I'll briefly describe the last of my problems with other revisionists. That was the big sort of set piece argument we had after the publication of Cultural Revolution about from above or from below. In other words, is Soviet history best understood by looking at processes that come up from below or from above? And Cultural Revolution was basically an investigation of a process which actually stimulated from above, but involved, but produced all kinds of from below manifestations. I always thought, I never thought everything is coming from below. What I thought was there's got to be something. Totalitarian model says by definition there's nothing coming from below, all comes from above. I thought that has to be absurd. This could not exist in any human society. But I didn't know what was what was happening below, but I thought that was the place to look. That was where I wanted to look. However, then I ran into trouble with people like Ayuraki and Lynn Viola, because they basically because I was saying that I think there's always a mix of from above and from below, and that is what is probably the nature of the mix with a state like the Soviet one is basically what's interesting, and the way in which what's going on below accommodates itself to the structure imposed from above is what makes it really interesting. That was the kind of thing I later on tried to deal with in everyday Stalinism. Just very briefly, I would say something about the purges. The purges were a terrible problem for us because it was basically the favorite topic of our opponents, and therefore it was a highly charged topic. So two things followed from that. One, many of us tended to steer clear of it because simply you're just buying more trouble. But the other one was that what people said in public about the purges did not necessarily correspond to what they really thought. So sometime I've forgotten the year, but it was when I was in Texas in the 80s, I had a little conference down in Texas, and it was about the Great Purges, and I invited basically only revisionists, and what was on the agenda. The agenda was say what you really think about the purges. In other words, speaking freely because you're in a closed group, say what you really think. I'm sorry, looking back, I think that one of the things I would indeed regret that I didn't look more at the purges, because I was so fed up by people saying this is the only topic to look at, this is the only thing you could look at. And it didn't seem to me I could look at it because I didn't have data. I by that time had some archival access, but it wasn't going to tell me about the purges. But when I look back at something like my culture, the article I wrote about the establishment of orthodoxies in Soviet culture, I started off as a cultural policy person. The establishment of orthodoxies, I now see that my point was that they were not more, that all professions established orthodoxies, but that they were not necessarily or generally Marxist orthodoxies, which put into question the notion that they were selected and imposed by the Politburo. But looking back at it, I can see that that argument would be much stronger if I had seen that the fear associated with the purges made people cling to an orthodoxy no matter what it was, because that was safer. You wanted to have an orthodoxy in your discipline so that you could know what line to toe, more or less. So let me leave it there.
Thank you, Sheila. That was wonderful. Lewis, you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Renny, and thank you again for organizing this. And I want to send my appreciation to everyone who is attending. Well, this is really fascinating, I must say. I've heard Ron and I've heard Sheila for now many years, but to have them sum up, in this way is wonderful. So I didn't anticipate that Richard Pipes would be quite so present, but so be it. And I want to mention that Pipes lives in the form of Jörg Baberovsky, whose review of the book I mentioned before, Reflections on Stalinism, you can feast your eyes on in the latest issue of the Russian Review. It is Pipesian in every sense of the way in which he has been discussed so far. Now, inevitably, I'm going to repeat some of the things that Ron and Sheila have said, but I also would like to assert that I have my own take on this question of revisionism and, the extent to which I identify or have identified with it and, what the currents within it, in my perception, have been. My first thought about this, having been invited to participate in the discussion, was, isn't it wonderful that these younger folks are interested again in revisionism? But then I asked myself why that's the case. And then there was another question. What do these people think revisionism was? What do they understand by the term? So there are some thoughts I want to share about the very term revisionism and how it relates to the work that I've done. I understand revisionism first to refer to that current in Western Anglophone Sovietology that revised the previously dominant narratives and tropes, as we have heard already, associated with the totalitarian approach that reigned supreme from the 40s through the 60s. Second, to represent a coming of age of historians in a field, as I think Sheila mentioned, or that had been dominated from its inception by political science. But third, among such historians, some self-identified as revisionists more strongly than others. At one end of the spectrum, and this hasn't been mentioned thus far, were the likes of J. Arch Getty, who set out in his Origins of the Great Purges, a book from the mid-1980s, I seem to recall, to contest the image of a tightly organized party controlled from the center by an omnipotent leader. Getty did so by bringing to bear the Smolensk archive that had been available for use for decades, that Merle Feinsod relied upon in that book Ron quoted from, but that had been relatively little used up to that point, and other such like sources to demonstrate that the party over which Stalin presided was badly organized, inefficient, and faction-ridden, reacting to social processes as much as instigating them. So what Arch and one can cite here Gabor Rittersporn and Bill Chase and James Harris and others, What they did was to expand historians' scope beyond the center to address the ways in which the center and the periphery within the context of the party and its functioning related. Well, that's one end of the spectrum of revisionism. At the other were those, among whom I will include myself, who focused not on the party, and here I'll be repeating some of the things that Sheila mentioned, but on social processes and classes. Initially workers and peasants, but also women, titular nationalities and national minorities, the disabled, soldiers, migrants, criminals, marginals, and others. The social historians who pursued these collective subjects emphasized one of the key contributions of the social historical enterprise writ large, namely social agency. Of course, we differed among ourselves about how these groups exercised their agency and the extent to which it mattered, the extent to which they succeeded. For a while, resistance captured the imagination of quite a few, be it of peasant uprisings, like the so-called Babi Bunti that Lynn Viola wrote about, strikes, such as the one Jeff Rossman focused on in a book called Worker Resistance Under Stalin, or the more common foot dragging in carrying out tasks assigned to them that was fatal to the planned economy, as, for example, Don Filzer argued over several volumes devoted to Soviet workers. But between the fearful obedience that was posited by a previous generation of scholars and acts of resistance, there was a broad spectrum of attitudes and behaviors that, so I have argued, played a significant role in defining the Soviet way of life under Stalin. Sheila's works, particularly Stalin's Peasants and Everyday Stalinism and Tear Off the Masks, are replete with evocative examples of Homo Sovieticus, as she termed it, experiencing ordinary life in extraordinary times, to cite the subtitle of Everyday Stalinism. My own book on Stakhanovism was structured around the give and take of the effort bargain that pitted official adulation against popular disdain. I also produced articles on comrades' disciplinary courts, those masters of the shop floor, foremen, prize-winning livestock and dairy state farm workers, production collectives and communes, and workers' clubs in the 1930s. These and other pieces I wrote, and I'm not ashamed to admit this, had dual inspirations. One consisted of the tradition of labor history, going back to, he's already been mentioned, not exactly dismissively, but as someone with whom Sheila did not identify, E.P. Thompson and the Making of the English Working Class. The other was my longing to get as close as possible to Soviet workers of earlier decades, to find out how they coped, not just their survival strategies, but their efforts to lead decent lives and provide for their families in conditions of endemic shortage. And when, in the 1990s, I finally gained access to archival sources and could read their letters to authorities, I felt I could almost hear their voices. Of course, what they wrote was constrained in all kinds of ways, whether letters of complaint or letters of gratitude. And of course, I was only getting brief glimpses into their lives, but at least they no longer were the gray, atomized automatons as so much Cold War-inspired literature had represented them. And at the same time, beginning in 1989 and extending over the next several years, I got to meet real lives, and I'm going to have to interrupt myself to say that you will hear some banging in the background, and that's because I sit facing a schoolyard in which drummers are practicing, alas. So during those years of the late 80s and early 90s, I got to actually meet real live Soviet workers, coal miners in Donetsk, as they were in the process of becoming erstwhile Soviet workers, and wasn't that exciting. But that's a different story. There's one final thing I'd like to say by way of samokritika. Did I tend to romanticize the Soviet working class? The answer is absolutely. In those production collectives and communes, for example, I saw both vestiges of early Soviet democratic practices and harbingers of what could be if only the centralized planning system were replaced by something like council communist arrangements. And I will add that meeting, really for the first time, actual living Soviet workers, not only partly disabused me of my illusions, and yet better to have paid attention to these men and women, and I'll admit, sympathize with them, than treat them as naive fools or discursive categories, or to have ignored them entirely. Now, I want to finally address the third question that Renny posed to us in an email message, which is what we make of the trajectory of the field today in what he termed the late stages of the post-revisionist turn, and what of the legacy of revisionism we think is worth preserving or returning to. Well, first of all, I confess I didn't know we were in the late stages of the post-revisionist turn. I thought we were all decolonizing. But more seriously, I want to end with some advice. Isn't that what old folks are supposed to provide? First of all, before making generalizations, such as the ones I've just been making, make specificities, or make sure you support your generalizations with specificities. Secondly, study not so much what worked and what didn't work in the hoary socialist past as what was tried and why, not only by authorities, but those over whom they were ruling. And then, why study the socialist past, the state socialist past? What's the use? Increasingly, I find myself drawn to that cliche first enunciated by L.P. Hartley in that 1953 novel, The Go-Between. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Thanks.
Thanks, Lewis. That was super interesting. Okay, Anna, would you like to go ahead? And I'll just say for timing wise, so we budgeted roughly 2 hours for this, a bit longer as it's a full panel. Of course, if people want to get up and leave the room, it's Zoom, so no one will be offended. I understand, of course, this is Europe for many of the people in the audience, so it's a bit later for you for there. But after Anna's done, we'll move straight on into discussions with the audience. So stick around for that. Okay, Anna, please go ahead.
All right. I'm deeply honored to be on this panel because the people on this panel, I learned a lot from them. And I actually started thinking about historiographical, conceptual, and theoretical questions as they relate to the discipline of history, thanks to the scholars that I'm on the panel right now. So thank you very much for the invitation, and it's just thrilling to be here. I will start with so my interest actually is in what I will call the demise of revisionism. And I would like to discuss it in the context of a discipline-wide transformation of conceptual, theoretical, and methodological habits in general. But first, just a very short detour into how I actually learned about revisionism. I entered the graduate school in late 1990s. Actually, I spent 2 years in political theory and only then went to history. And I was completely unprepared. I knew literally very little about a historiographical and theoretical past or the present of the field. And my introduction to revisionism actually was via the critique that was unleashed onto the school by advocates who today we will probably know as advocates of the cultural turn. And in turn, they were basically very much influenced by post-structuralist analytics. And then my book that I mentioned at the beginning, on history writing or sleepwalking through history, I actually refer to post-structuralist analysis as a post-structuralist worldview, because ultimately this mode of thought didn't enter into social sciences by means of a critical discussion. It actually was it was accepted as just a new revelation about what the history and the world were all about. So yes, I do need to mention Stephen Kotkin here, because he positioned himself as a revolutionary. He was absolutely not interested in having any conversation with the past scholarship. He described revisionist tradition in particular as clumsy, conceptually, theoretically, and methodologically. And if you have the audacity to describe revisionism as clumsy, then you, by definition, must have profoundly simplified the pre-1991 conceptual legacy, which was deeply and productively grounded in Marxist, Burdelian schools of thought, and in various forms of structuralist analysis that we have already mentioned here, like modernization theories, convergence theories. All of this this is basically not impossible. This is impossible to think in those terms unless you actually have some kind of that you are aware of some kind of structural analysis. And by structural analysis, I mean like macro social, macroeconomic structures that exist regardless of whether historical characters know about their existence. They just that you cannot really intuit them through text. You cannot touch them. They are invisible, and you need to study them. So this is what led me to write my tenacious liberal subject essay, which I should have actually called not liberal subject, but neoliberal subject, because the level of simplicity of the subject that you find, for example, in the totalitarian school, and also that actually did transition into the cultural scholarship. To call it liberal actually would be a compliment. So I think a neoliberal subject, like if I have to rename the article, it would be like the nation's neoliberal subject in Soviet studies. But as I mentioned, that now I actually want to talk about the fate of revisionism, not from the grounds of US scholarship on the Soviet Union and modern Russia per se, but as a symptom of the discipline-wide theoretical and methodological reorientation toward cultural history and post-structuralist analysis, which I actually believe that for our field, at least, this reorientation was quite detrimental to the development of our field. And also, my larger question is that actually what happened to then analytical apparatuses of social sciences and history in particular, once basically methodologies and theoretical and schools of thoughts before that had dominated the field before 1991 or before 1980s actually were marginalized. So the larger story is thus about the discipline of history, the way it shut the door on Marxist schools of social analysis, on the Burdelian school of social analysis, on all forms of cultural and relational analysis that basically would pertain to macro-social, macroeconomic structures. And thus, it's a completely different analysis of power relations in the world, like in 1980s and to the present. So if I have to say one non-controversial thing about the revisionist school, it will be that macro-social and macroeconomic analysis was the school's basic, indispensable, and defining analytical apparatus. Right. And when we talk about macro-social and macroeconomic, we're talking about structures, and we're talking about structuring powers of those structures. And this is how actually the totalitarian school was challenged. And I would say that revisionists, scholars who worked in the 60s and the 70s, whether they identified themselves as revisionists or not, grounded us in what we know about the 1920s and 1930s, socioeconomically. So they and actually that's why actually I was quite surprised by Kotkin's descriptions of the revisionist school of thought, because at that time I also worked with Moshe Levin. I wasn't at Penn, but I I went to Penn just to kind of basically because he was like I wanted to take a class with him, and I knew that kind of the analysis that actually Moshe Levin did, that actually Sheila Fitzpatrick did, that Ron Suny did, Lewis Siegelbaum, who actually basically were all interested in unprecedented and far-reaching processes of social, economic, political, administrative transformations of the 1930s. It just doesn't fit the characterization of clumsiness. So what is interesting to me is that the skills that the generation of the 1960s and 70s possessed, actually the skills were not really passed to the next generations. So that no one was interested in studying totality, intensity, scale of transformations of the Russian social fabrics. And we have this kind of understanding that, oh yes, 1920s and 30s, there were dynamic periods. And somehow after World War II, things got on to, were becoming more and more stagnant. Even though actually Moshe Levin did go into writing on the post-war period after, basically when the whole the field actually became cultural field, one scholar, it turns out, cannot turn the field around, right? And also it doesn't really help that we basically don't read the books which were written in 1970s and 1960s, 1970s, 1980s on social history, on economic history, which that literature actually went right into 1970s. And it's not, it basically was kind of the start, there should have been like starting grounds for further research, but this is where this research actually discontinued. So the making of cultural history took place under a completely different set of conceptual markers. And I will just give you like this, the logic of post-structuralist critique cannot be made up. I mean, like you really need to, so the very kind of with this new mode of analysis where the structural and micro-social will become actually the dominant forms of the dominant research sites for historians, the very act of studying macroeconomic and macro-social dimensions of society, which I would say structure, was accused of contributing to the reification of structural regimes of oppression. So people actually were afraid in 1990s, at least like when I was in graduate school, people were afraid to even mention the word, such words as structure. No one, people would not be, basically this is the time where the Marxist tradition is considered to be completely irrelevant for the study of society. And if you actually give, if you give up on this, on structural analysis, then there is a certain sequence of events that should follow from that. So if one is not comfortable with structural analysis and one is not comfortable or suspicious of Marxist simplifications, then one would de facto not be interested in social and economic research. And therefore you would also grow quite disinterested in labor history, because labor history is predicated, which is the backbone, by the way, of revisionist scholarship. But if you're no longer interested in structure, you're no longer interested in labor history, you're no longer interested in class as a lived reality and also as a category of analysis, and also as a very radical Marxist critical and category analysis. And you have no tools for the study of social structure. Right. So what happens is that you basically scaling the connotations of what the social means, even what the cultural means. So also interesting things happen to the concept of power for revisionist school and like for any Marxist or Bordelian, like any school before 1990s. The study of power would have to do something with organized forms of power, and therefore you would have to include the state. Right. But if you're not comfortable with organized forms of power because you actually perceive those organized forms of power as somehow refining of those organized of power that you don't recognize, then you actually kind of, again, descaling your research, and you pick very different research sites. You're more interested in towns, you're more interested in in a smaller scale research sites than actually kind of structural analysis would call for. You also, if you're not interested in organized forms of power, you're also no longer interested in organized forms of struggle, right? And actually, kind of the scholarship on unions, on working class solidarities. I mean, they were completely wiped out from the 1990s and the early 2 decades of the 21st century. And the result is that what we have economic and social history that exists only so far that 1960s, 1970s scholars actually covered. We also missing about 2 generations of scholars who could have worked on post-war period, but they didn't because the field was basically got disinterested in social and economic history. So our knowledge extends doesn't extend beyond 1930s and 1940s. As a colleague and friend of mine, Oscar Sanchez-Sibony, basically would always tell me that he would say, well, cultural historians don't even read our books and they don't read the books from 1960s and 70s. They're profoundly uninterested in what we have to say. So in my opinion, this is basically kind of what we really kind of what have been observing for the last 20, 30 years is the fact is that the development of the field actually kind of got stalled. And now when we want to jumpstart the research in economic, social, labor, history, and political economy, those scholars basically have to reinvent themselves from scratch. And also, it is quite interesting how difficult it is for scholars who have started working on labor history, on political economy, how difficult it is for them to find jobs in American academia. Basically people that I know, they don't have jobs yet, which are permanent. But if we give up on structural analysis, what do we have in place of this kind of understanding that we do understand that there are larger structures. So, what do we like? And the rules of writing demand that we actually gesture towards the microsocial and microeconomic, even though we don't really study those aspects of Soviet life any longer. So for the post-war period, what we have instead of structural analysis, we have metaphors, which are masquerading as analytical categories. Like one of those categories will be stagnation. There is no work that actually can prove statistically that there was an economic stagnation, in a very serious manner, how much restructuring was happening in the post-war period. We actually need to, we cannot use this category as just a larger framework for analyzing anything we want. So I really like how Sheila talked about totalitarian school when she discussed their modes of analysis as masks for value judgments. And I believe in kind of like our metaphors is basically our masks for value judgments. What we also have instead in place of structural analysis, we have figures of speech like planned economy without a plan. This is also just incomplete. It's a simplification. The Soviets invested enormous amount of time into planning the economy after World War II. We also have anecdotes where we say, well, they prefer to work. We pretend to work. They pretend to pay. And it's quite possible to present late socialism as kind of this time where cultural forms were quite dynamic, economic forms were quite stagnant, which is a very problematic thing, for example, for a Marxist, when you actually kind of have this vision that somehow socio-cultural development of society is being disconnected from economic development of society, which you presume is actually not really, which is stagnating. And I just want to give a very brief kind of account of what I think we don't know. And this is only my angle into this conversation because I'm now going back to my kind of what was supposed to be my second book on imagining socialism in the Soviet century. And I have a very long list of things that I think I need to know, and I really do not have any secondary literature to look at for the Soviet Union, not for Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe is a bit different system, different case. So what we don't know about Soviet economy, for example, we don't know how it operated after World War II. We don't know how Soviet society reproduced itself. We don't know what the Soviets meant by profit, profitability, surplus, market. Some of us don't probably even know that the Soviets used those categories. And those categories were indispensable categories of thought, theorization, and planning in economics, sociology, and basically even in party documents. And they are not vacuous. They actually have meaning and they have been applied. And if I have to read Yuri Lieberman because this is the only place you can actually find kind of understanding what they meant by that. So what we also don't know, we don't know the history of the Soviet welfare state, this extravagant undertaking, and we don't understand how the surplus kind of that was created by the Soviet society was invested and reinvested into the Soviet society. So in other words, we don't know how the surplus, and of course they produced because the growth actually did take place. We don't know how the surplus circulated through and in Soviet society. There is a very interesting book by a Russian scholar, Galina Ivanova, and this is the first and path-breaking book that actually start kind of explaining what was done in terms of redistribution of wealth after World War II, starting with the with the early 1960s. So, and it was interesting that the welfare state was an apple of discord between the party and social scientists in 1960s and 70s. Social scientists, many of them were Marxists, and not Marxist-Leninist Marxists, but actual Marxists. They were not convinced at all that to jumpstart such a massive and inclusive construction of welfare state that basically was based on the communist principle to each according to one's needs was a wise undertaking for the 1960s and 70s. We also don't know post-war theories of socialism which were indigenous to the Soviet Union, and how hard Soviet sociologists kind of fought and how determined they were to learn from Western sociology, but at the same time, not to borrow its interpretive apparatuses. And I think they actually succeeded in doing that. There is also a price of cultural history paid for this discontinuation of social and economic research, because ultimately there was no reality check for interpretation. So what happens in cultural history is that the cultural history actually recycles academic analytics developed from the 1930s into the post-war period. So this is just kind of my sense of so like for me, like the history of the demise of revisionism and why actually kind of methodologies, research sites that empowered revisionism actually do need to come back. This history needs to be told kind of in a larger context. Kind of the neoliberal remaking of American society and the world and intellectual fashions that this remaking introduced into U.S. social sciences and also history. I'll stop here.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anna. That was super fascinating and very generative for me personally. Okay, so we're going to move into the Q&A. Because there's a lot of people here and we have limited time, I'm going to take a round of 3 or 4 questions and then put it to the panel for them to process as they will. So please, if you have a question, raise your hand, and keep in mind to be, of course, polite and short in your questions. But I would encourage people also to think personally, not just historiographically, about what does revisionism mean to you in the same way that the panel does. Rossen, go ahead.
Hello, thank you so much. This was really an education. I have 2 questions, one of which is historical. Since we've already discussed the ways in which revisionism battled with the totalitarian school and its in the post-totalitarian models, I wanted to ask you about the polemics about maybe a different sort of polemics, namely with Marxists, both internal to the revisionist groups, but also to external ones, whether, what you make of Marxist critique of various revisionist scholarship. And the other question, and really apologies for its shamelessly political character, looking at the membership of Black Sheep, we do have historians, quite a number of them, usually have a younger generation, but most of those historians, with a few exceptions, some of whom here on the Zoom call, most of those self-identified leftist historians do not work on identifiably leftist scholarly topics, I've been going around with this question, and unable to answer an answer why there is this disjunction. We've discussed how, you know, a lot of revisionism has been motivated by a certain 1960s spirit and politics, and I wonder why there's this disjunction of, you know, people who are active in the graduate student unions or active in politics in Eastern Europe or the post-Soviet world, but who in their scholarly production are not necessarily working on recognizably leftist topics.
Thanks so much, Rawson. Brian, would you like to go ahead?
Thanks, and thanks everyone for this absolutely fascinating conversation, which also brought me back a lot of memories as well. And I want to follow up with a question that's based on this fascinating, I think, analysis of the changes that happened in the 90s. So I was in graduate school in the 80s, and to me, figures like Sheila and Lewis and Ron were the people that my generation, of course, was going to overturn and bring in, you know, real scholarship. Yeah, right. You know, it's always the most proximate previous generation one is attacking, and I know that. Which, you know, it took a while to outgrow that hubris. But one of the things that I remember being one of the common sort of lines that people of my cohort talked about a lot was a little different than what Anna was describing there. And that it was not so much that we were rebelling against a sort of structuralism in the name of a post-structuralism, but rather it was this issue that both Lewis and Sheila mentioned of these debates about from above and from below, and how do you think about those categories. And I think a lot of my peers and I often thought that, so the scholars that were coming right before us had overturned the history from above and introduced social history. And that I remember so many conversations about how we were happy that had happened, but also we felt that it was precisely missing in the structural arguments that we sort of wanted to try to recover. That a history from below lent itself towards a microhistorical approach that made it very hard to talk about structure. And so that, you know, if the scholars of the 50s were the thesis and the revisionists were the antithesis, you know, a lot of us wanted to be the synthesis that would find a way to somehow bring structure back in, precisely by reading and then selectively appropriating some of the post-structuralist thinkers that were entering the discipline, you know, in the 80s and 90s. And I'd be really interested to hear about what Ron, Sheila, and Lewis might have to say about that sort of perception of things, you know, looking back on it from this time.
Thanks, Brian. You look sort of haloed, like there's a glowing light appearing above you. So this was it's very interesting.
That's just my natural sanctity.
Yeah, maybe. And maybe one or two other questions before we put it to the committee? Panel, sorry. Yeah. Stephen Smith, I assume, from the name?
Yeah, sorry.
No worries.
The engagement with the panelists for me was extraordinarily important, and I'm slightly younger, but certainly not part of the kind of post-structuralist reaction against revisionism. But looking at it from a British point of view, and I really, in many respects, defined myself against a British point of view for a certain point in my career, I kind of realized just how much stronger the whole totalitarian paradigm was compared with Britain. I was a very self-defined Marxist. My first book comes very, very directly out of political activity in what was then the International Socialists. And there was no problem in Britain. I mean, I deliberately chosen not to do graduate work in Oxford and had gone to Birmingham. Birmingham gets very, very little kind of coverage in this kind of American discourse. And, you know, I have to be honest, at a certain point, particularly when the cultural turn came, I was reacting very, very much against a rather kind of stilted sort of largely economic history that was being done. But I went to Birmingham because Michel Levine was there. And, you know, it was an incredibly exciting time. And it was not just about Marxism. It was the women's liberation, gay liberation, all these things were happening right next door to cultural studies. That's where the centre was. And so much of what's described by American colleagues always seems to me American. And for me, as a Marxist, for example, although E.P. Thompson was hugely important, also important were the French historians of Labour, Michel Perrault, Yves Lequin, those people who were trying to do a kind of total history. And Michel Levine in some ways mediated that in the British context. I mean, he was in Britain for 10 years. And so, you know, although I don't think he was a great supervisor, he did manage to kind of feed in much of a kind of larger world, both in terms of his personal experience as, you know, a Jew disillusioned with Israel, but wanting to write in a very, very empathetic way about the Soviet experience. So really all I'm saying is that in some ways, you know, what's being described doesn't quite fit me. I mean, I didn't ever really like the label revisionist. For me, what was much more important were the arguments within Marxism, which, you know, in part were about issues of, Lewis touched on them, but, you know, issues of at what point the revolution had been lost. This was a kind of major, and continues to be a major driving force in my own work. I mean, I work on China these days, but it is, you know, what went wrong, looking at the potentiality that I think did exist in 1917 and for a short time afterwards. And I was actually quite alienated by, say, Sheila's work. I mean, she's a wonderful historian from whom I've learned a lot. But, you know, I remember her saying when I was still a graduate student and dared to talk about the betrayal of the revolution, she got terribly upset about it. And that for me kind of highlighted, you know, the fact that revisionism was absolutely not a single thing. It was very, very much, you know, an internal kind of debate among Marxists, among leftists more generally. And that was, for me, much more important than this totalitarian paradigm. I suppose the fact that I couldn't bear to stay in Oxford to do my graduate work must mean that at some point I did not want to engage with the Leonard Shapiros and all those kinds of people. But I just want to kind of put on the table that there is a bit more of a kind of non-American context to all this. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. And Andrea, good to see you again. I'll give it to you, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for all these amazing talks. I just have a quick question for Anna. Anna, you paint a very stark picture of how post-structuralism basically ravaged the field and left nothing in its wake. You know, its rejection of empiricism and its taboo on sort of analyzing certain economic structures as merely reifying the oppression of those structures. My question to you is, did post-structuralism's rejection of teleology, was that also something that stunted the field in the same way that you described? That's all.
Thanks, Andrea. Okay, these are a great set of questions. I'll let the panel take it as they will.
I start?
Sure, go ahead, Ron.
So, it's so good to see, or not see, but hear at least Stephen Smith. It's been a long time. This was a wonderful discussion, very, very interesting. So, first thing is, there weren't that many Marxists in America. Marxism was, you know, totally marginalized. You paid a price if you said you were a Marxist. And I usually don't announce at first to my students that I'm a Marxist. I did that when I first went to Oberlin, but that was a different thing. And then let people understand and then maybe talk about Marxism because everyone has their own idea, mostly wrong about Marxism. Some think it's still base superstructure or whatever. And so I'm very much, careful about when I use that term. At the moment, it's again on the block, chopping block. Now they talk about here in this country, you know what's going on here, Marxist equity. Well, I'm for Marxist equity. If that's about being egalitarian, I'm all for that. So I think what Anna was getting at and what I worry about most, and I once had a debate with Sheila about this over what I consider one of her absolutely best articles, The Bolsheviks' Dilemma, which is about class. The argument was, don't dismiss a whole tradition of scholarship and investigation and serious engagement with categories and ideas that Marxists are always evolving in. Rather than saying I'm a Marxist, I'd say I'd like to become a Marxist. I'd like to understand fully. I'm reading a book now called Citizen Marx, which is about his early republicanism. I mean, they're just new things all the time. It's such a fertile, it's like saying, you don't like Freud or something. I mean, you can't live without these people, Weber, Freud, Durkheim, whomever. These are so fecund. That means fruitful, I think. So, that's all important. And the one thing I would do, and maybe this is a question to Anna, and I'll stop there, is the social revolution and the interest of Marxism in more structural analyses, though that also was changing over time, right? I remember Moshe Levine saying to me, that someone like Stalin was a social force. If you have a person with that kind of power, like Trump, this becomes a social force, right? It's changing the way the world works. It's changing discourses. It's very important. I don't see how you can do social history after a certain point, and I lost friends over arguing this years ago in Russian Review, without the cultural turn. That is, structures aren't structures just given, as Anna knows very well, and we all know. They're all about how they're understood, how they're perceived, what meanings are given to them. So take seriously the various trends in Marxism. These are intense people who are still, at least in America, always on the margins, and therefore have to defend and nuance what they're doing, and see the ways in which the cultural turn, feminism, which was so important early on. Once feminists begin to question the category of gender and sexuality, then everything's up for grabs. Class, nation. Brian and I deal with nation, and it seems to me you can't do one without the other. That's the main point I would make.
Can I come in at this point?
Sure.
Yeah. I want to take up the question of, give my take on what revisionism was in the sort of history of the discipline, which is obviously a very different one from Anna's. It seems to me that almost invariably in a discipline or in a group of disciplines, there'll be a dominant view. And let's say totalitarianism was something like the dominant view in study of the Soviet Union in the 50s. And then that's going to be challenged. And it's going to be challenged usually on the grounds where it is weakest, where it doesn't tell you anything. And totalitarian model was therefore challenged by people who want to be social historians because it wasn't telling anything about the society. But then inevitably you're going to have a challenge to the challenge. I mean, that's the way things go. Indeed, I'm sure Marx would have agreed that that's the way things go. And in our case, the challenge, as I perceived it, to our, by the time we had become something like a dominant orthodoxy, that challenge indeed came from the cultural turn. It came from the Kotkin people. Now, it did not, from Anna's description, she is presenting a similar challenge or an equally serious challenge from a sort of structural point of view. I didn't see it as equal. I saw the successful challenge as being from the cultural people. And indeed, I thought, just as we had seen in our challenge to the totalitarian model, we had seen its weak point and shown what you could do by another approach. So they had they'd done the same thing. It was found somewhere which was less developed in our approach and run with it. I thought very profitably. One thing I was quite struck by Anna's statement that basically there was revisionism and then nothing of any interest followed. This is, I think, absolutely wrong for Soviet history. The cohort that followed us, which were neither pro nor and some were, I suppose, revisionists of revisionists, but and some weren't. But people like Terry Martin, Oscar Sanchez was one noted. I'm going to list my people, but the ones who studied with me in Chicago, Julie Hessler, Kirov Tomov, Gorfo Alexopoulos, Mark Adler. There's a whole series of them who contributed enormously to our understanding of social and cultural and political processes, including in study of the post-war. And in fact, in many of the specific questions Anna asked, I felt like saying, well, just go and read one of these people because they are illuminated quite strikingly. Now, for Steve, I would like to say, yes, I really agree with you that the UK was a very, very different environment. And a much more congenial one. I mean, my move to the US was a sort of accident, and then I stuck there. In terms of intellectual climates, okay, in the US, you had Shapiro and E.H. Cower at each other's throats, but you could talk to both of them. I mean, I did. I was in touch with both of them. They both disapproved of that, but still, they were okay with it. The Birmingham people, yes, absolutely deserve to be properly into our story, because not only Levine obviously moves to the US, but Bob Davis and all the people working on the economy. There's really interesting stuff going on there. And my sense of that was there was lively disagreement and argument, and it was different in a positive sense than in the US. There was a great deal of outcasting in the US, and well, as Ron said, the Marxists didn't want to say they were Marxist. It was that kind of pressure. You worried about what you could afford to say. I don't remember that being the case in England in the same manner at all in the 60s before I went.
So I'll try not to repeat some of the things that have already been said by Ron and Sheila, with which I entirely agree. But on this question of Marxists and the extent to which we were informed by Marxist discourse, Rawson was the one who originally raised this. In my own case, having done my graduate work at Oxford and then gone to Australia, so I, in a sense, somewhat like Sheila's, although a native-born American, I, came to an American academic environment that with some shock. That is, Marxism informed me, and of course, in the 70s and into the 80s, Marxism was all. I mean, if we think about French Marxists and I remember discovering Adorno, and this was just the world to me. So, if anything, yes, I had to sort of trim my sails in the United States, but still found enough people with whom I could engage in serious conversation and investigation, so that the cultural turn had an impact. And here I'll move on to some of the points that Brian raised. I remember what I'll have to admit, revelation it was to encounter Jochen Helbeck's work, The School of Subjectivity. I appreciated it immensely, and thought it had a place within the framework that had been developed thereby up to that point. I think I'm reinforcing a point that Ron made, yeah, I'll stop there in the interest of time.
Lewis, can I just remind you of one thing? Lewis and I decided to have a conference at the at Michigan State on labor history, and it was going to be called The Making of the Soviet Working Class. It was going to, that Katz-Nelson volume, you remember, had left out Russia. So we were going to add to it. And we have this conference, and there's Laura Engelstein and Bill Sewell and so forth, cultural turn people. And they attacked the sort of, unmitigated social history of some of the people. And the book turned around, and when it finally came out, we thought it was going to move Soviet labor history forward. It turned out to be the last book in Soviet labor history, or one of them. It was called Making Workers Soviet. In other words, we completely were overturned by the cultural turn. Sorry, Anna, your turn.
No, I remember that volume. I read it. So, okay, first, I want to talk about teleology and a particular form of post-structuralist Foucauldian critique that was unleashed on, not just on kind of like on the field of history and social sciences. So to me, I would like to know, like, basically, this is how this critique works. Like, the critique is articulated. There is no evidence given who exactly in any field who is actually a teleological thinker, right? So to me, the accusations of Marxist historiography or of any kind of other forms of historiography that pre-existed, that worked with larger structural kind of questions, which I think, basically, I'm not saying that this is something that this work needs to be done in order for any kind of subjectivity studies to make any sense, because without a larger context, I mean, you don't really know how to interpret things. You're going to be actually kind of imposing your own associative thinking into your own sources, right? So who was a theological thinker? Like Hobsbawm? No, he wasn't. Like E.P. Thompson? No, he wasn't. Foner? No, he wasn't. Eric Foner? No, he wasn't. Like, I don't know theological thinkers who actually were, like, they didn't exist. Right. So if we're talking about teleology that actually was a principal attack on Marxist school of thought, I perceive it as an ideological tool that is literally being used to discredit, and also allows you not to engage with a scholarship that is so primitive and simplistic. Seriously, you don't need to pay any attention to that. So this is how the shift actually can take place. Like, so kind of, to me, that's not an accidental thing. And my interest, like, kind of, and also that I don't need to say, well, I have skipped a lot of steps. I have finished the book. I'm just processing something that, like, it's very difficult to process it into 10 minutes, 20 minutes. So, like, every chapter actually deals with a different category of analysis, like structure, the social, resistance, ideology. Like, we got rid, like, there is no kind of concept of ideology as it had existed beforehand has actually also gone. We replace it with power. Then what actually happens to power is a category analysis. But in general, what I'm interested in, I'm interested how certain methodologies and schools of thought become toxic, to use the contemporary term. Like, they're just being marked as toxic, and somehow you have, like, several generations of scholars who are you don't want to touch those methodologies. And I do not think that it's just kind of an academic preference. I mean, everyone just stopped being interested in certain forms of analysis and then actually moved towards different forms of analysis. And if you doubt that there was this major shift into cultural, textual, microsocial, I never said, like, microsocial was always present shift. You just need to look at who got prizes, what books received American Historical Association prizes. The vast majority, like, for the last 30 years, this is all cultural history books. Any other forms of scholarship are not being rewarded by the field. Things will change. There are exceptions, but just there is no way of not noticing that, right? And the history of modern Russia, on the modern Russian field, is like, it's a very important chapter and this history, like it's impossible, it would be difficult for us not to be part of it. But so I'm just trying to figure out what happened to us and what's the political and conceptual kind of ramifications of the last 30 years. I personally not fond of subjectivity studies. And again, I can only tell you like the reason that it was possible because actually the social and economic infrastructures had already been created by other scholars so that you can actually interpret and you can talk about subjectivity in relation to 1930s because we actually had a script for what was happening in the 30s economically and socially, what kind of transformation was taking place. Like try to do subjectivity studies for the post-war period, you're going to use the same analytics from the 1930s. And that is a problem. And that actually to me means that however much scholarship there was there, political economy is not a very popular field, and it's actually exceptionally complex field. I mean, like you cannot just start doing political economy. You actually need to read Marx, right? So like it's like, and when you start reading Marx, you realize, oh, so actually things are much more complex. And then you start understanding other Marxist scholarship in much better detail. You understand what the conversations are taking place there. So I just also want to make to Brian's points. Brian, your work is a great is a guiding role. Like it's very very important to me because your work on Polish economic history and economic policies that I read it with my graduate students a lot, and this kind of scholarship doesn't exist for the Soviet Union. Like that's why, in order for me to think about profitability, you need to go to the source. You need to go to Soviet sociologists. You need to go to Soviet economists. You need to even you can't actually get it out of secondary literature. So, and I just want to make also my former graduate student James Neely here. I can tell you how difficult it is to write labor history for the post-war period if actually you kind of starting from scratch. Right, like you don't how do you build your own narratives and how you actually work against narratives that had been already kind of formed, but they were formed for previous decades. It's very difficult. So but I don't have really a stake who is a revisionist, who is not revisionist. I'm just more interested. I'm interested in what kind of methodological and conceptual frameworks become less popular, and I'm interested in political kind of reasons for why that happens. So that's my kind of interest. But I do think that revisionism actually was always a synthetic school. It was always about bringing all different layers of social analysis and economic analysis together. So when I want to talk about structure, I basically very much simplify. I'm talking about macro and macro social, macro kind of economic layers, and that is actually to the last comment to Ron. I do not think that this is that you can just access those structures through perception. This is not a question of perception. So those structures misrepresent themselves. And you need to have actually academic skills to understand how those kind of undergirding structures that actually organize our everyday life, how they operate. It is not just a question of perception. And this is one of the things that I don't like about cultural turn, because cultural turn basically says, well, everything is socially constituted and constructed, therefore somehow we can actually get at them through representations. I don't think we can.
I agree.
Well, thank you all so much. I really want to end. This has been a long session, so it's before the hour. I want to thank everyone for coming. I'll also just say my own one thought that's generated by Anna's comments is about the different generational perspectives that history gets imbued with, and thinking coming in as to say a Marxist scholar in the 1960s. Not that everyone who was a revisionist was, of course, but either a Marxist scholar or sort of informed by it or vaguely affiliated with it, and being confronted with, say, someone like Richard Pipes, reporting you to the CIA and accusing you of being a Bolshevik, etc., versus coming in as a Marxist scholar now or in the past, 20 or 30 years, and being dismissed as old hat and boring, and that it's an inherently outdated theory, as if it ended with, the last word was said by E.P. Thompson, and nothing theoretical has come since then within the Marxist framework. And I think that's, of course, maybe a less serious confrontation than what that older scholars had to deal with, but also a difficult historiographic challenge, something that's very hard to overcome. You know, how do you really prove that you're not outdated? Saying this for any Marxists in the room, obviously I'm not one because, you know, I'm waiting to get a job. But anyways, thank you all for coming. I'm sorry we didn't have more time for the Q&A, but there is a Facebook group for this event. There's also a Facebook group for the BSS. I would encourage people, if they have questions, maybe throw them there, send them by email to any of the panelists, or send them to me. I can pass them on. I'd love to continue the debate in other ways. And look for future events from the Black Sheep Society. We'll have a stream of panels at ASEEES, quite a few, I'm not sure how many. And we'll have other events like this in the future. You can, again, sign up on our listserv, and there's lots of really interesting discussions and advertisements for other groups as well. Anyways, thank you again so much to our panelists. A big round of applause for them. Really, really glad to have this very productive, really exciting conversation. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Renny.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Okay.
Have a good day.